She unpicked the threads and inherited every death, the quilt that sews you in. Grief makes archivists of us. We hold on to things, objects, photographs, patterns, as though the beloved dead have pressed themselves into the material world and left impressions we can touch. There's something tender and true about that instinct. The dead do leave impressions. The body of a person moves through the world for decades, and the world, at some level, registers it. But some objects don't just hold memory. Some objects hold consequence. The difference between the two looks identical from the outside. Same weight, same warmth when held. Same feeling of connection to something larger than yourself. It is only when you begin to pull at the threads that you understand what the fabric was actually doing, what it was holding together, and what was always waiting, patient and certain to be made whole again. Margot Vane had been a textile artist for 22 years, which meant she had developed this specific kind of sensory intelligence that comes from decades of living close to fiber, an instinctive reading of weave density, thread tension, the age of dyes, the history of use encoded in wear patterns. She could hold a piece of fabric and give you a reasonable estimate of its era, its origin, its purpose, the way a sommelier could with wine. She picked up the quilt from her aunt's estate and knew within seconds that it was very old, very complex, and unlike anything she had made or studied in her career. The aunt, her mother's older sister, a woman named Ruth, who had lived alone in a farmhouse in the hill country for 40 years and who had been, in the family's quiet lexicon particular, had left Margot specifically the quilt and nothing else. The will had been explicit. The quilt went to the textile artist. Ruth had not explained this. Ruth had not explained many things. It was a patchwork, hundreds of small squares of varying fabric, sewn together with an evenness of stitch that Margot recognized as extraordinary. Not machine-made, the stitches had the microscopic inconsistencies of handwork, but the tension was so controlled, so deliberate, that it surpassed what most people were capable of by hand. Multiple hands, she concluded, each square slightly different in its stitch personality, a slightly different grip, a slightly different rhythm. Multiple people across time, all contributing to the same design. The fabrics themselves were a record, homespun linsey-woolsey from what she estimated was the early 19th century. A square of calico that looked Civil War era, morning crepe, clearly Victorian, early 20th century cotton prints, pieces she recognized from her own grandmother's era, and then her mother's. And in the center, a square of contemporary linen that looked unworn and unaged, as though it had been waiting. She spread it on her work table and photographed every inch of it. In the photographs, something emerged that wasn't visible to the naked eye. Faint patterns in the individual squares, shadows within the fabric that took shape only in the flat gray light of the photographs as specific forms. She enlarged one on her laptop and sat with it for a long time, turning the screen. A figure, falling. She enlarged another, a figure, horizontal, arms folded. Another, a figure in water. Each square, she began to understand, contained a death. She did not find this as disturbing as perhaps she should have, which may have been a function of her training. She had spent her career looking closely at objects that held human history, and human history was substantially made of death. She was curious. She was also, if she was honest, moved. Each square, a life. Each death stitched into the fabric by someone who had outlived the person it depicted. A record of grief rendered in thread. She began to research the names. Her family's genealogy was extensive on her mother's side. She'd always known this, always felt a vague pride in it, without paying much attention. Now she traced it backward, generation by generation, and found the correspondences. Abigail Vane, born 1801, drowned in a river crossing. Eleanor Vane, born 1834, died in a fire. Clara Vane, stillborn 1867, a tiny square, the smallest in the quilt, a form that barely occupied its space. She moved through the squares, forward through time, and found each woman, and found each death, and the quilt assembled itself in her mind as the most extraordinary act of intergenerational mourning she had ever encountered. She began sleeping under it the third night. She dreamed of Abigail Vane first. The river in the dream was not nightmarish. It was autumn-lit, wide, the ford shallow, and the crossing ordinary until it wasn't, until the horse stumbled and the cold came up very fast. The dream had the texture not of horror, but of memory. The specific flat inevitability of something that had already happened, that couldn't be changed, that simply was. She woke in the morning feeling not frightened but heavy and sad in a clean way, the way you feel sad about history. She dreamed of Eleanor Vane the following night, the fire. She dreamed through the generations in order, each dream a complete and specific death, each one carrying that same flat quality of historical record. She began keeping a journal beside the bed, writing down details each morning, the name of the river, the color of Eleanor's dress, the sound Clara had never made. She felt, obscurely, that she was doing the quilt's work, witnessing. She talked about it to a friend who was also an artist, a woman named Sarah, who listened carefully and said, "Have you tried touching the stitches to see what you feel in the individual squares?" Margot had not. She sat with the quilt that evening and ran her fingers across the squares, one by one, and found that she could feel something in each one. Not through any mystical sense she'd have been uncomfortable naming, but through the straightforward sensitivity of hands that had spent 22 years reading fabric. The stitches of each square were different, tighter in some places, and in one square, a Victorian mourning piece. The square she associated with a woman named Harriet Vane, who had, according to the genealogy, died in an asylum in 1889. The stitching had been disturbed. A thread had been pulled slightly loose, the tension wrong, as though someone had begun to unpick it and stopped. She thought, what would happen if I finished it? She got her seam ripper. She told herself she was a textile conservator assessing damage. She told herself that she was trained for this, that she understood fabric, that unpicking a damaged seam was a professional act, not a transgressive one. She told herself these things carefully and then began to pull the thread. Harriet Vane died 1889 in the Shenandoah County Asylum. The genealogy was vague about the cause, something respiratory, something that the family had not dwelt on. Margot had dreamed of her 2 nights before. A stone room, a narrow bed, a sound like breathing that grew steadily worse. The thread came free in her hands. That night, She did not dream of Harriet. She dreamed of herself. The dream was brief. She was standing in her own workroom, looking at the quilt on the table, and in the dream, the quilt was breathing. An almost imperceptible rise and fall in its surface, like a sleeping chest. And in the center square, the contemporary linen, a form was beginning to emerge. Not a death, a figure in the process of being stitched. She woke with both hands pressed flat to her sternum, checking for breath. She was fine. She told herself she was fine. She thought about Harriet's thread, loose on her work table, and thought about the asylum and the stone room and the narrowing breaths, and thought, that's not her story anymore. That was the dream she was supposed to inherit. And she didn't. She's free of it now. She did not consider where the story had gone. She was coughing slightly by mid-morning, a tickle in the chest, the kind you dismiss. By afternoon, it had developed a texture, dry and rhythmic, and something underneath it that reminded her uncomfortably of the sound in the dream. She drank tea. She opened the windows. She told herself it was October, the cold snap, the dust in the farmhouse she'd been spending weekends in to deal with Ruth's estate. She unpicked another thread that night. Margot Vane, born 1897, died of fever at 31. She told herself she was engaged in conservation work, restoration. She told herself she was setting them free. By morning, the cough was gone, replaced by a fever of 102. She saw the doctor, who found nothing bacterial and prescribed rest and fluids. She rested. She recovered in 4 days. She went back to the quilt. She unpicked 11 more threads over the following 3 weeks. The deaths arrived and departed in sequence, each one lasting exactly as long as the original dying had, compressed into days rather than the hours or weeks of the original event, and each one leaving her body exactly as she'd been before. She told herself she was processing them, metabolizing history. She told herself this was grief work, important grief work, and that she was in a unique position to do it. The center square was developing a pattern now. She could see it when she photographed the quilt. A figure, still incomplete. Arms, torso, the suggestion of a head, no face yet. The stitching accumulating as though a needle was moving through it in the hours she was away from the workroom. Sarah came to visit and stood over the quilt for a long time without speaking. "Margot," she said finally, "how many threads have you taken out?" 43. Sarah looked at the center square. "And there's new stitching." "Yes." "Did you do that?" Margot looked at the square. The figure in it was almost complete. The outline of a face had appeared since she'd last checked. Not detailed, not yet, but oriented toward her with the facing outward quality of a portrait rather than the profile of narrative action. Looking at the viewer rather than living through an event. "No," she said. Sarah left. Margot sat with the quilt for the rest of the evening. She ran her fingers across it, all of it, the whole surface, every square. The ones she'd unpicked were flat and relaxed now, unburdened. She had done that for them, she thought. All those women, all that carefully stitched in death, and she had released them. She had done something good here. Her fingers reached the center square and stopped. The stitching was warm, not the ambient warmth of a body that had been lying close. Warmer than that, and moving. Beneath her fingertips, the thread was moving in slow, minute increments. The needle she couldn't see drawing the final outlines, completing the face. She looked down. Her own face looked back at her, rendered in thread, in the center of the quilt. She pulled her hand away, stood. The workroom was very quiet in the way that rooms become quiet, when something in them has finished waiting and begun to act. The quilt lay on the table, her face in the center square, complete and still and slightly smiling, the way you smile in a photograph for someone you'll never see again. She felt, at her back, the precise and weightless sensation of thread beginning to move. The quilt wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't designed to trap Margot. It was designed to contain, to balance, to carry the weight of familial consequence across generations in a form that could be held and felt and witnessed without destroying the holder. It was by any honest measure an act of love by the woman who first made it. But Margot was an artist. And artists, more than most, cannot leave a thing alone when they believe they understand it better than it understands itself. She thought she was liberating her ancestors. She thought the threads were prison bars, and she was the one with the key. She had 43 years of professional training that told her damaged stitching should be corrected. What she didn't have. What she couldn't have, because Ruth had never explained it, and the women before Ruth had never explained it, and the woman before them had chosen the vessel of the quilt over the vessel of the body precisely because someone had to hold this. Was the knowledge that the balance requires a holder. When you empty a vessel, something fills it. When you unpick a karmic tapestry thread by thread, convinced you're doing restoration work, you are not freeing the dead. You are reassigning. Ruth knew. That's why she left it to Margot specifically. She hoped the artist would understand the craft well enough to leave it alone. She did not, I think, fully believe that hope. The quilt is complete now. The center square is finished. The women after Margot will dream of a workroom, a table, a figure bent over its work. The death will be specific and complete, as all the others are. And someone, someday, will run their fingers across that square and feel the thread and think, what would happen if I unpicked it? Thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Ilara, and I am your whisperer. I'll be here, waiting for you next time. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more. This has been Karma Quietly Whispers. See you soon.